I'm Jeff Boer, CEO and founder of TriDot. We do optimized training programs based on actual data from actual training and race results, rather than relying on philosophy and tradition and theory. With training for any sport, especially triathlon and endurance sports, nutrition is just a critical component. And in the same way, you hear a lot of talk about protein and hype and fads and trends about protein. Well, today I'm super excited to be able to drill down to the actual food scientists that are doing the research that all of these other people are referring to. So we're going to go directly to the source. And today we're going to be talking with three different people. Dr. Heather Leidy, she really focuses on satiety and protein's role in curbing hunger, controlling your hunger, as well as controlling your body composition, whether you're trying to lose weight or maintain an optimal race weight. And we're going to be talking with Dr. Doug Patton-Jones as well. He really focuses on protein's role in protein synthesis and maintaining muscle mass. For athletes in general when you're training a lot, but also as you get older, masters athletes, how do you maintain that muscle mass as you age, and also when you have periods of less activity or reduced activity due to injury or in the off season, different things. So that's really critical as well. And also Dr. Mike Roussell, he really focuses on cardiovascular disease and protein's role in just a general healthy lifestyle, heart healthy living. So I'm really excited to share with you today these talks with these three experts that are out there on the forefront of research around protein and how it impacts us as endurance athletes. Enjoy.
So my name is Dr. Mike Roussell, and I do research with protein and heart health, and then I also work with athletes and executives and helping them improve their performance, in the field, in the court, or also in the boardroom. And I'm going to share today, some of the research that we did at Penn State, look at the impacts of different kinds of proteins on health, and then, really also kind of talk through the direct link between how you take a high performance diet and you take a heart healthy diet, and how those two things don't need to be separate. They can actually be the same. So first thing that I think it's important to talk about is cardiovascular disease, because the diets that we looked at and that I'll talk about as kind of the foundation were all based on improving and reducing risk for heart disease, which whether you're an athlete or not, heart disease is a huge and major concern as you get older. So just kind of, if we were to talk about like statistics, because, while we know heart disease is a big problem, we don't necessarily realize how big of a problem. And, it's estimated that on an annual basis now in America, you get over 400,000 people die a year from heart disease, and they have over 1 million acute events. So, for example, an acute event would be something like a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. And so you're looking at over 1 million of those a year in America. And this is also what's crazy is that it's a huge financial burden, as you can imagine, on the system. So if you imagine in 2010 it was estimated that there were about $273 billion were direct costs from cardiovascular disease, and that it's estimated that in 2030 those will be $818 billion. So it's a huge, there's a huge financial cost that also goes along with this big problem with cardiovascular disease. And I think what's amazing about nutrition, and what I love so much about nutrition, is how powerful it is and the impacts that it can make. And so, one of the things that people don't necessarily realize with heart disease is that it is the #1 killer in America. And then if you add up the #2 and #3 killers in America, cardiovascular disease is still higher than both of those. So it's a huge problem that can really easily be addressed by diet. And, as a high performance athlete, you already have the exercise side of the equation down, but there are a lot of other pieces, specifically nutritionally related, that you can help. So when you look at heart disease, there are a handful of risk factors. And some of those risk factors we call modifiable, and some of them we call non-modifiable. So examples of non-modifiable risk factors would be things like genetics, gender, or age. We have not found a good way to slow down or reverse aging technically yet. So age is a modifiable, non-modifiable risk factor. Then you look at modifiable ones, things like smoking status, obesity and diabetes. These are generally not problems, in a high performance triathlete area. But things like elevated total cholesterol, elevated LDL cholesterol, which is also called your bad cholesterol, reduced HDL cholesterol and also high blood pressure, can be issues with anyone. People who are, like hyper aerobically active or very sedentary, these things can, these can be an issue. So when we look at treating cardiovascular disease, one of the things, and I'm sure whenever you sat down with your physician, that this is a conversation that they bring up at one point, is your LDL cholesterol. And so that's generally seen as the primary risk factor for heart disease, and that's one of the things we'll talk about with how we made these diets that we worked on at Penn State. And so basically we want to reduce your LDL cholesterol. The idea has always been to reduce your LDL cholesterol as much as possible. And so long time ago when the government got together and they put all great scientists in a room and they said, what are the diets, or what are the dietary components that we can put together to help reduce risk of cardiovascular disease? And so they called this the National Cholesterol Education Program. And their main target was, saturated fat. So in the American diet, and lately, saturated fat has been a huge news topic. And there's more research nowadays maybe suggesting that saturated fat is not as much of a target. And I think especially with athletes, there's been a pushback and encouraging people to eat more saturated fat. And I think when you look at your heart health, and this is what I talked about at the very beginning, when you look at balancing your heart health and then also balancing your performance, overeating anything is not a good idea. And so I think controlling saturated fat, just like you're going to control excess sugar, just like you're going to control excess protein, you don't want to overeat any of those things. And that's kind of one of the messages that I hope you get from our conversation today. So when you look at, what's the best diet for heart health, and you think maybe, well, what's the best diet for an endurance athlete, there actually can be rather similar. And so on the cardiovascular disease side of things, the DASH diet is seen as kind of the gold standard of heart healthy diets. It's been, robustly researched for decades, all the way back to the early 90s. And, the components of this diet are very, probably they're very familiar to most people. Rich in fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy, lean meats and poultry, and also nuts, seeds, and legumes and beans. So it's like a very wholesome, well-rounded diet that's low in saturated fat, it's low in refined grains, it's low in added sugar, and it's also generally low in red meat. And that's something that we can kind of talk about in a little bit when we get into the research side of things. So over the years, what happened with the DASH diet was researchers were like, well, how can we make this better? So if you think about in the context of diets, the DASH diet is kind of more of a traditional higher carbohydrate diet, which has also been kind of a traditional approach with endurance sports, about 55 to maybe 60% of total calories from carbohydrates. So the researchers got together and they're like, well, what if we start playing around with these other variables? Like what if we play around with the unsaturated fat level? So look at, kind of adding more olive oil, more nuts and seeds. What would happen to the diet then? What if we started adding more protein, right? What would happen to the diet then? And I think actually, these two questions are also really very relevant for endurance athletes. So if you look at with a higher unsaturated fat diet, so right, adding more things like more olive oil, more nuts, more seeds, right, what you're going to do is you're going to reduce the total carbohydrate content of that diet. And so the kind of shift you're making from a fueling perspective is you're going to prime your body to use fat more as a primary fuel source than carbohydrates. So if you want to be more aerobic and use more fat as fuel, this could be a diet that benefits you at a higher level from a performance standpoint. But then you also think, well, what if we add more protein? And this has not been historically as popular in endurance sports, but I would say the benefits of a higher to even more moderate protein diet, I think, are really starting to show across all types of athletics. But researchers, in the kind of mid-2000s, were around 2005, we're looking at how do we, if we increase protein, what does that do from a heart perspective, which is something that we never really thought of that much in heart health. So they took basically protein in the diet from what people generally eat, which technically is about 18% of your calories from carbohydrates, so a little more than say what would be like the RDA for protein. And they moved it all the way up to 30%, just about 30%, which if you're kind of have read a lot of popular diet books, it was almost like a zone kind of type diet. And what they found was that diet led to the greatest reduction in estimated 10-year risk of cardiovascular disease, and it saw the best improvements across basically every marker that they looked at of cardiovascular disease risk factors. So there was something about consuming more protein, even independent of exercise, which we've always looked at protein being the key component of exercise, but independent of that, just looking at your overall heart health, this great benefit. And so this really comes back to something that we talked at the very beginning about fusing kind of a diet that's good for your body and also a diet that's good for your performance. So one of the things when we're looking at beef, kind of the research I'm going to talk to you about, is how we looked at the context of, well, can you take other proteins like beef and put it into this heart healthy diet? Because as I mentioned, the DASH diet generally doesn't have any beef. So one of the big pushbacks is you'll hear, well, red meat's bad for you. How could I eat red meat and then also be a good part of the diet? And part of that comes from these larger population-based studies where, people are given surveys to fill out either, every year or every couple years, asked about their eating behavior. And, in the context of different foods, I think it's really important that we're very specific with the kinds of foods that we're talking about. So red meat, for example, is a very broad class. So in some of these studies, red meat could be considered, a hamburger, a processed meat sandwich, bacon, Spam, a hot dog, any of those things, a filet mignon, all those things together would be considered red meat. And so there's a huge variability in that. So someone who's eating, hot dogs for dinner would fill out the same thing of a person who's eating like a grilled sirloin steak for dinner, right? They would answer the same thing on these questionnaires. So there's a lot of muddling of the research, and that's a point of context for a lot of people. But what we found is that when you're actually looking at, when we take lean portions of meat, right? So if people generally eat lean chicken or fish, well, there's a beef alternative to that. So there's lean beef, and now I think they're around 38 or so cuts that meet this kind of criteria, cuts of beef that meet this criteria for lean. And so we're like, well, what if we take those and put them into this heart healthy diet? What would happen? And I think, a good example of that, how you could tell someone one thing like red meat, and to eat red meat or eat beef, you could say one thing and then they go do a totally different thing. A great example of that is ground beef. So you can go to the grocery store and you can get ground beef that's, 73% lean or 97% lean, and kind of a handful of different ones in between, right? So you're eating, like if your coach tells you to have ground beef for dinner, right? You think you're doing what your coach is saying because you're eating ground beef, but you bought the 73% because it's cheaper, and your coach's mind is thinking you're going to get the 97 or the 95% lean, right? Because it's a leaner, kind of probably better food for you. So we're talking about the same thing, but we're actually doing different things. And I think that happened a lot with the research around red meat and why it was getting excluded from diets. And it's actually, a key component, I think, nutritionally for a lot of athletes and a lot of people, because it has, it's very rich in nutrients. So, one of the other big differences is processed meats, right? So when we're talking about red meats, we're talking about processed meats, which would also be, like I jokingly, talked about a Spam sandwich, but hot dogs or bacon or things that have been cured. And, that's really where, as research has evolved, that's really where we've learned about kind of the negative effects of animal proteins, are the ones that have been processed. And, with the dietary guidelines, the 2010 dietary guidelines came out, and they were talking about, what's the evidence, for red meat versus processed meat. They said that basically there's limited evidence from these large population-based studies for animal products and cardiovascular disease, but there is a positive link between processed meats and cardiovascular disease. So definitely a big difference in that all red meats, are not considered the same. So in research, between these, these large population studies, like they give us good information, but then people want to know, well, where do we get more details? How do we get cause and effect? Because these large population studies don't give us cause and effect. They just give us associations, whereas, red meat consumption, eating more red meat is generally associated maybe with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, like we've just been talking about. But then if we look at clinical trials, which give us more cause and effect and allow us to start looking at, more similar things. So lean red meat, like lean beef and chicken or turkey, right? Something like that. there were about 5 clinical trials, starting in the 80s, going up till now, looking at comparing those two things and their impacts on cardiovascular disease risk. And they found basically similar effects on reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, regardless of which protein you chose. So, that really starts to show us that there are lots of different ways to eat a heart healthy diet, or there are lots of different protein sources that you can use to fuel your efforts. So one of the I think the next questions that's becoming, we're getting asked more and more is about plant proteins. And plant proteins, specifically kind of the research with plant proteins started with a lot with soy and heart health, because soy has cholesterol lowering effects, but also with beans and nuts and seeds and their protein content. People have started asking, well, what about plant proteins, and can we use those proteins to fuel our efforts, and how do they fit in these kinds of diets? And I think plant proteins are great. I think one of the things, and hopefully you'll get this kind of at the end of the talk, like our message, or kind of my message from this, is that there are a variety of different proteins, and that you can basically, you can eat the ones that you enjoy, as long as you're eating not the processed versions of them. Like if you enjoy chicken, or if you enjoy tofu, or if you enjoy a sirloin steak, all those have a place in your diet, both from a heart health perspective and also a performance perspective. Back to kind of plant proteins and heart health, these large population-based studies, again, were showing these relationships between plant protein and reduced blood pressure specifically. And one of the reasons why, you'd see plant protein and blood pressure is that plants carry a lot of key nutrients. They can carry a lot of magnesium and potassium and things that'll help lower blood pressure. And so I think one of the keys to eating, kind of a whole food based diet is all those other things that come along with the foods that you're eating. So if you're eating lots of vegetables, you're getting a lot of magnesium, you're getting a lot of potassium. If you're going to eat a food like beef, you're also going to get heme iron, right, which is a bioavailable meaning that your body can readily absorb it. It's a form of iron that your body needs. And as an endurance athlete, iron is so important because it's the thing that's going to help you shuttle oxygen throughout your body, on your red blood cells to fuel your muscles so they can keep going. So if you can consume foods that have all these nutrients with them, excuse me, if you can consume foods that have all these nutrients already with them, that's going to help your overall diet get better. And that's why I think we saw this link initially with plant protein and blood pressure. So kind of about the research that we did at Penn State, what we wanted to look at was if we took that DASH diet like we'd initially talked about, and we added beef to it, so choosing a protein that had traditionally been excluded, but made sure all the nutrition matched. So all the macronutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, all those things stayed the same, but we just used different types of foods, right? If we did that, what would happen? And so that study, we called it the BOLD study. BOLD was an acronym for Beef in an Optimal Lean Diet. And we had, so this study was really interesting. So it was called a controlled feeding study, which basically means, I think this is like everyone's dream, where we weighed and measured food for all the participants and fed them for essentially 6 months. So no one had to cook anything. Everything was weighed, measured, and portioned kind of perfectly for them. They showed up at a kitchen on campus every morning, and we gave them a cooler of food, and they would come back the next day and get more food. So it was a really good deal for the people that were in it. But so the diets that we looked at, we used an average American diet, which had more added sugars, some more refined grains, and was higher in saturated fat. We had a version like the DASH diet, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Then we had the BOLD diet, which was basically the DASH diet, but instead of so much poultry and fish, we added in lean beef, about on average 4 ounces a day of lean beef. And then we had one more diet, which we called the BOLD Plus diet, and that was the higher protein diet. So if you remember earlier in the conversation, we were talking about the Omni Heart study, where they looked at a high unsaturated fat and high protein version of the DASH diet. We wanted to do that same thing, but do it the high protein version with beef, but then also other things. We used cottage cheese, Greek yogurt. We got added protein from all kinds of places, edamame beans as snacks, and just whatever we needed to do to get that protein up to about that 30% of calories again. And we wanted to look at kind of the effects of these different diets on heart disease risk factors. So from a saturated fat perspective, because at the very beginning when we were talking about LDL cholesterol and talk about how saturated fat is kind of the thing that's going to drive those changes in your blood. Saturated fat was the same. So regardless of proteins, regardless of the kinds of proteins people were eating, their saturated fat intakes were all the same. The protein intakes, kind of total protein, was basically the same for our average American diet and for the DASH and the BOLD diets. And then we had that BOLD Plus, which was the higher protein version. So that was higher, more like at that 30%, closer to 30% of calories that we talked about, which is similar to like a zone type diet. And then we looked at beef. So generally we used very low beef intake for the DASH diet and also the average American diet. We used 4 ounces a day, which, if you think about 4 ounces a day is actually not a very large portion of beef. You'd be hard pressed to go to a restaurant and be served a 4-ounce portion of beef, right? So it's not a lot, but it was very consistent. Lunch and dinner, they would have 4 ounces a day, and then also the BOLD Plus, which would have on average about 5.4 ounces a day. So a little bit, slightly more. If you think recommendations for lean meat was at about 5 ounces, and we were at 5.4 ounces. So a little bit more than recommended levels. But I think for an athlete, being up at about 30% of calories from protein, this BOLD Plus diet would probably be the optimal one for you. And then one of the things that we did with our study, it was a controlled feeding study, but it was also, they called it a randomized controlled feeding study, crossover design. And that meant that everybody was on every single diet. And one of the reasons that that scientists will do that is, between you and me, there is, even if we ate the same thing, like biologically we're different, right? There's just that variability from person to person. And so with a controlled feeding study, if you eat every diet, then as a researcher, we can compare your body's response to each diet, and you basically get to use yourself as the baseline, as the control. So it factors out kind of that biological variability between people and allows you to get much more clear cause and effect. So it's generally these control feeding, which is you give everybody all the food they're eating. Randomized crossover design studies are considered like the gold standard of nutrition research. So after this whole time, everybody was on every diet for 5 weeks. So with little compliance breaks so people could eat things that they were craving in between diet periods, they were about in the study for 6 months. So it was a big time commitment. And we found that whether subjects or whether these people were on any of our diets, like any of our test diets, so the DASH, the BOLD, or BOLD Plus diets, they saw a reduction in their total and their LDL cholesterol of about 10% from when they started, from their baseline measurements of the study. So, which is kind of profound and great. And then we also found that blood pressure, and so these weren't even people with high blood pressure. They were essentially, you would call them average healthy Americans. So no one's cholesterol was too high, but slightly elevated. No one had high blood pressure. But we saw with the high protein diet, with our BOLD Plus diet, that diet, those people saw the greatest reductions in blood pressure. And so this, I think, this was kind of one of my favorite parts of one of our favorite findings in the study, because we found people who didn't even have high blood pressure and we were still able to get blood pressure reductions. So kind of the big takeaways from the BOLD research that we did at Penn State was that you could eat a variety of different proteins. If you like to eat chicken, or if you like to eat fish, or if you like to eat beef, you can eat a variety of proteins at both kind of a moderate to high level, like our BOLD Plus study, or at more of an average level, kind of where, kind of the average person is, and still get similar reductions in your total and your LDL cholesterol compared to, kind of what an average person would eat. And that, we continue to show that with a higher protein diet, you get better reductions in blood pressure. And so this is really, I think the BOLD Plus shows this great connection between, I view the BOLD Plus as more of a performance, a diet that's closer to optimal performance kind of diet, but then it also seems to be maybe the best diet for your heart health as well. So one of the messages that we've kind of been talking about, and I just alluded to, is that you can have different proteins but get the same effects. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was, well, if we take the research that we did, but then we also compare it to kind of the other research, what happened? Like, we looked at those original DASH studies, and we looked at the original kind of that OmniHeart study, which was one of the first ones to do that higher protein, heart healthy diet. What happens? Because we use different proteins than they did. And what we found was basically you get the same reductions. We saw the same reductions in that LDL, or kind of your bad cholesterol, than they did with these other studies. And when you look at the kinds of foods that we fed our subjects across the different diets, especially the beef-containing diets, and the kinds of foods that were eaten in these previous studies, the proteins are really all over the place. Like low-fat dairy is probably the most consistent, but from vegetable proteins, poultry, eggs, and beef and pork, like all those proteins are very different across all those different diets, and yet they saw similar effects. And so this again furthers, the idea that what the proteins that work best for you are the ones that you should eat, because those are the ones, because you can get a variety of effects from different ways. And I think one of the big sticking points for people with nutrition, and I've noticed this kind of with nutrition across the boards, whether it's just kind of a non-athlete to kind of a more of a fitness bodybuilding type strength athlete to an endurance athlete, at a variety of different levels from amateur to professional that I've worked with, like compliance and actually consistently eating the foods that you should be eating on your diet, that's one of the biggest factors. And so I think these findings about different proteins, similar effects, are very liberating for you, because it allows you to eat the foods that you enjoy. You just need to do it in the right portions, right, and in the right amounts, and you can still fuel yourself in an optimal way. And that point was further struck home by this follow-up study that we did, which we called the Bold X study. And now the population for this study was people with metabolic syndrome. So this would be kind of the opposite of an endurance athlete. So these are people who are generally overweight with insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and low HDL cholesterol. So kind of all the, kind of the opposite of all things. But what we did was we looked at a diet that was high in plant protein, we looked at a diet that was high in animal protein, and then we looked at kind of, again, one of these more higher overall protein and also higher animal protein, higher beef diets, and the effects on metabolic syndrome. Because metabolic syndrome is basically, if you think about it at the most basic level, it's kind of like the unholy marriage of diabetes and heart disease, right? And it comes together, and it's probably the biggest health problem that we're going to face in the coming years. And so we wanted to see, well, if you took these diet ideas and applied it to treating metabolic syndrome, what would happen? And what was really interesting was that we found that weight loss was the most important thing. So in that study, we allowed people to lose weight, because weight loss fixes a lot of those things, a lot of those issues with metabolic syndrome. But we found that weight loss was the main driver. So again, further emphasizing this idea that whatever you're going to stick to that's going to get you the end result. So in these people, weight loss was kind of the end result. And when they stuck to a diet, they would lose weight. The people who stuck to the diets lost the weight, and they saw the greatest reductions in these risk factors. And so the diets that you enjoy are the diets that you're going to stick to. So the proteins, if you enjoy eating, beef, then you can eat beef and get your results. If you enjoy eating poultry, then you could eat chicken breasts and get your results. It's about finding those foods that you like and then putting them into your diet in the right ways, and doing that consistently, that's going to get you the result. I think that's really the important take home, and that when we look at a diet that's good for heart health and a diet that's good for performance, you can bring those two things together, but then kind of the secret sauce that makes it work is your adherence and your compliance to that diet. And food selection, I think, is the big driver. In my experience with working with clients, food selection is going to be the biggest driver, because if you like what you're eating, you're going to continue to do it. So one of the most common questions that I get about when we're talking about protein and these higher protein diets and eating different kinds of protein is, are we eating enough protein already? And it's a really good question that I think when you look at with protein, you just need to look at your overall diet. And so what's kind of depressing is if you look at the diet of people on average, Americans, our top calorie sources are alcohol, grain-based desserts, sugar-sweetened beverages, grains, pastas, and then like chicken mixed dishes, which would be kind of like chicken fingers and not boneless, skinless chicken breasts. But that's really where people are getting all their calories. So if we take some of those calories, and I would say too, like the span of people that I've been fortunate enough to work with, whether it's like the professional athlete who, eats cupcakes before his game, or just kind of the youth soccer coach who has a couple beers. Like the spectrum is not, everybody's eating those foods. And so I think in everyone's diet, there's room to shift out these low nutrient kind of I don't want to say bad foods, but foods that aren't really giving you a lot of bang for your buck, to protein foods, which give you a big bang for your buck. We talked about earlier, we were talking about the iron in beef, and if you talk about, like the nutrients in eggs are, another big protein food, which are rich in essential amino acids. So protein foods carry a lot of nutrients with them, and based on how much protein most people are eating, they could afford to eat a little bit more protein and displace some of those other calories from things like sugar sweetened beverages and refined grains that aren't really giving them anything back nutritionally. So then, an also real common question is, after we talk about, different dietary ideas like this and finding proteins that work for you and increasing protein in your diet, is like, how do you get started? Like, what's the best place to start? And I think a lot of times people want to jump in and do 5, 10 different things at once and really get going with it. And I think that's a big mistake, because the more changes you take on at one time, the harder it's going to be to maintain those changes. And if you want to consistently, become a better and better endurance athlete, right? It's not about going out one day and doing all kinds of training, right? It's about being consistent with your training over time. And the same is true with your diet. So the key here is you want to make slow, gradual changes. And I think breakfast is a great place to start. You could start with protein at breakfast, or you could start at your kind of post-exercise meal. Either of those places are going to be a great place to start. And getting protein is going to be really important at either of those places as well. So finding some protein that you can eat at breakfast, or if you don't eat breakfast, starting and eating breakfast. And then right after you exercise, making sure you're getting a full meal with carbohydrates, and then also some proteins to help jumpstart the recovery. Those are two very easy places to get started where you're going to get a benefit from adding protein to your diet.